Hello and welcome to the Vault of Liz Jones. My name is Liz and I am so happy that you're with me for today. So, today in this episode, we are going to be covering a deeply personal and polarizing institution, which is the institution of marriage. I mean, everybody and their mama has opinions and stances, and their views, and they're like, oh, hell-bent on them, right? So for many, marriage is not just a legal contract. For many, it represents the literal foundational blueprint through which you get to build their lives, right? Their futures, their families, and because the stakes are incredibly high, so is the discourse around it, and then the debates get to be incredibly fiery and triggering. The institution of marriage, too, it has come from so far. So many historical structures defined marriage as being tied to property, kinship, reproduction, allies, and it has only been through, I think, the last century where it has evolved to now being about finding a romantic partner and finding a partner and personal fulfillment. So the conversation has grown, marriage has evolved, so has the expectations of it. So today I really wanted to dive deep into the opinions, the stances, the discourse around marriage, and we're going to cover it mostly from the very radical stance, which is the anti-marriage stance. And the anti-marriage stance is basically the discourse and the sentiment that is for the opposition of marriage. And even before we begin, I think it's very incredibly important that I get to clarify that there's a difference between, public perception and the true philosophy, of the anti-marriage stance, in that most people view people that are opposed to marriage as one. You guys fear commitment, that their stances are driven from a fear of commitment, that you are a selfish, cynical, emotionally unavailable bitch, and you should just shut the fuck up about this institution. And so your stances do not have any meaning here. And number two, it's because of the personal bitterness, in that you were just unlucky. You haven't found love, or you have gone through a terrible breakup, right? So that is what is informing you to be have this extreme view about this dynamic. And throughout interacting, watching, researching about these stances, I found out that that couldn't be further from the truth. That couldn't be further from the truth. And most people that are opposed to marriage are asking the questions of, why do we have to involve the government in this dynamic? Like, why is it that this setup of a monogamous romantic relationship is what is propped up as the ultimate way for us to view partnership, and it's given a higher social status, and that there's a push for, let us view alternative ways of family structures, of building family, of partnering with other people. Let us value deep friendships, unconventional family structures to be just as valid as, the marriage setup. And of course, the idea of, like, why do I have to support, right, an institution that has historically put women at a disadvantage, and even now in the modern setup we can see a hint of that. And I think it is very, very possible for to be anti-marriage, and that doesn't mean that you're not pro-love, pro-romance, and pro-commitment. I've seen very polarizing statements around the anti-marriage stance, and I love a good polarizing statement. I love something that makes us stop and think. But the con of having polarizing statements is that most of them have a deep, valid core truth, but the messaging is packaged in such very completely extreme language that it becomes very, very tempting for me to be like, no, 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 no. So, and we're going to see so much of that. It'll be 40% true and 60% extreme. And it's like, And the beauty about life is that you don't have to agree or disagree entirely with things. You can reach a point of, like, I can understand how this claim has come to be, but also be like, I don't think that it's enough to come to this conclusion, and that we can understand that there's a valid core truth in some of these statements, but also be like, I'm not going to also swallow a bad analogy just just to also, come to the conclusion that a social problem exists. And so I invite a sense of open-mindedness, a sense of like when it's too much to just take our water and learn how to do our breath work. So the intent of this episode is to really take a look at these claims, and it was a transformative experience for me because, as I said, I have to sit with things that I do not firstly agree with and try to find if there's any core truth, and also train myself to critically criticize claims when they I feel like they've lost the plot, and also to make this a resource and a guideline for me to refer back to when I am making decisions on partnerships and how I want my future relationships to look like. And I hope it gets to serve you and your journey. And there's literally a lot of discourse surrounding this topic, so many claims, so many opinions, and so many stances. And I've done my best to pick, I think I placed five where I feel like they are comprehensive in bringing some of the issues that I grapple with about the institution of marriage. And we are just going to sit with them, investigate them. What do we feel about them? What do we think about them? And hopefully I can and we can shed a light and we can become more clear at where we stand with this institution. So I'm ready when you are. You're ready when I am. Let's get into it. So the very first prompt is marriage is a patriarchal institution that should be abolished. And I feel like to effectively cover this, we have to define patriarchal and abolishing. So, patriarchy is the socio societal structure in which men hold the primary power, and abolishing is the completely doing away with, right? And in this case, doing away with the institution of marriage. So, patriarchy, how it manifests in marriage, is the socio and the historical blueprint in which men get viewed as the head of the household and the overall decision maker, right? So, the argument that it is a patriarchal institution that should be abolished mostly stems from the idea that marriage is an institution that was never built for the benefit of women, and therefore it should be abolished. That historically, this setup has been built on the oppression, the subjugation, and the exploitation of women and their labor. And it gets to manifest itself right now, even in modern marriages, on the unequal distribution of domestic labor in the home. That modern upgrades right now and legal reforms right now are just but a cosmetic fix. Like when we look historically about the institution of marriage, that husbands and men have held legal authority over their wives, controlling even their movement and their reproductive choices. And the for abolishment of this marriage from the basis of it being a patriarchal institution also rests in the point of like there's a reinforcing and control of women's bodies too, even when they look historically and then now. It's like for many parts of history, like marriage was the framework, right, in which men wanted to know and understand who their heirs were for the purposes of inheritance. Even right now, it persists in the loss of bodily autonomy and consent that is implied when people, get married. In that, when I say I do at the altar, most people still view it as complete unrestricted access, especially to a woman's body, where you cannot say no because it's apparently this big ass violation. People that are against the dynamic of marriage simply say that even with the legal reform, like it still significantly puts so many women at a disadvantage. And I do understand the sentiment of like the roots of marriage are in patriarchy, and that the patriarchy still persists in some ways, some way or form, even in modern marriages. But then, are we, when we root for abolishments, right, are we then saying that the history of a system, when it's rooted in patriarchy, is doomed from the start? Is there going to reach to a point where reform can be enough for us to be like, yeah, fine, or that any attempts at legal reform is never going to be enough, and that is abolishment really, really the key? And I don't know, for me, I really do not believe in total abolishment of the marriage dynamic because I believe in the freedom to choose, and I feel like it is deeply oppressive to take away people's choices simply because you do not agree or believe in them. And I feel like if anything, our capacity to choose should be increased, and that doesn't happen when we have limited choices. So total abolishment for me, I don't think is the way we should be viewing this at all, but more so an influx of other unconventional family structures to be held in the same regard as this dynamic, where you can value deep friendships and community care, and in whatever way you want to have the partnership dynamic in your life to be just as valid, and not to prop up marriage as the only way to understand partnerships. And also, like, even when I was researching a lot about this, the main critique around the anti-marriage stance is when we opt for and we want to actively push for abolishment is the fact that we are indirectly saying that women are not capable of making independent, free, smart choices about their own partnerships. And I was just like, I was taken aback every time because, yeah, I do understand that it can come off as that way, but I think so highly of women that that doesn't even cross my mind to think about, because it's just like that's a stupid thing to even insinuate. You know what I mean? But I do understand how when we say that we want to take away these choices from women, it's also an implication of like, we think you're not capable of making an informed choice, so we're gonna just take away the choice from you instead. So I see that, but it's not what I insinuate whenever I agree with the anti-marriage prompt sometimes. And it's also the question that Fadili was raising in the debate of like, are we then saying that no relationship between men and women can be non-patriarchal? And I mean, I feel like patriarchy is just like something that you have to be sensitive about and really stay on the lookout for, because we are socialized in a system. We don't exist in a vacuum. We are influenced by the things that we see. The structures that we see become deeply ingrained. So I feel like it is possible to have an institution that feels free and not bound by the socialization of patriarchy. It's very possible, but also very unlikely. I feel like you need to get into this with your eyes wide open and not just hope that the partner that you're with is going to realize when they the dynamic that, hey, some of these systems are set up for to disadvantage me, and I need you to really be aware of that. But more so an understanding of like, we're stepping into this, we know how historically this has been, and so how different is it going to be for our dynamic? How are we going to approach this? Do you think gender roles are thing that we should adopt? I think not. I think not, please no. But it is something to just like consider and know, because like it's a high chance that when there's no dynamic setup from the start, that you're going to fall back into a traditional setup that is going to feel that is maybe going to feel oppressive in the long run. I have the question that Fadili also brought up in the debate. Is it Fadili? Oh my god, I'm keep saying Fadili. Is it him who brought up? No, it was the lady. I still haven't known her name. I'm so sorry. But she was talking about like, when we want to base our stance on total abolishment just on the history of patriarchy, then that is deeply unfair and not the right way to look at things. And the institution that was cited as an example is the mental health institution. That its history is deeply flawed, and it has some atrocities in there in terms of like the practices that were carried out in the past, where people with mental illnesses were put in cages. I mean, they did conduct frontal lobotomies on people. So there has been atrocities that have plagued the mental health framework for years. This dark history is precisely the reason why mental health professionals really do go through intense ethical training. And the field in of itself has survived by actively looking in diagnosing and curing its systemic flaws. And I think like it is deeply unfair, right? If we have that perspective of like, just because the history is this, then we need to abolish it. But being about like legal framework and consistently shedding away the parts that do not serve us or the parts that are unethical or deeply unfair is how we make these systems or institutions serve us at the end of the day. So it's valid in that way. I think people should step into marriage understanding that it has origins of patriarchy and that it is going to creep in into your dynamic unless you step into it with your wise eyes wide open and you're on the same wavelength, on the same page with your partner about how this dynamic is going to be for the both of y'all. Because unless you're open and unless you're conscious about them, then it's going to fall back on what traditionally it has been, which can be as offensive. I don't think total abolishment is the key or the answer. The next prompt is marriage is a form of legalized slavery and sex work. Oh my god. This is a statement in which when I saw it and I was like being like into it, I was like, what the fuck? The fuck? Who actually said that? When it was said? um, because obviously that doesn't apply to modern marriages, especially ones that where they're dual income and where we see like women are significantly getting into the workforce at a higher rate than men these days. So it falls flat when we say it's a form of legalized sex work. Um, because they are economically, being able to fend for themselves. We should get into why she said that, Emma Goldman. And this lady is someone that I am like, I stand her so bad. I stand her so bad. Like she was truly iconic. She left her country, Lithuania, I guess, in at 15 when her dad banned her English literature kind of book as a statement to say like what women are important for is just knowing how to cook and to bear children for the man. And she was like, fuck y'all. And then she went now to the US where she now found her career of being a political rebel. And it's interesting because they used to jail her ass. And at one point, she was dubbed one of the most dangerous people of her time. Why? Because of the things that she spoke. They were too radical. And even now, I think some of them would be viewed as too extreme in this time and age. And back then, it was in the 1900s. Crazy. And the most one where got me geeky and be like, was when she was like, so she is an anarchist, and that is basically a person that is against authority and systems of authority and power that are oppressive, patriarchy, war, marriage, sometimes marriage, right? And so she was against marriage, and then it goes on to say, although she was against marriage, she still got married a few times for personal convenience and to retain her citizenship. And I was like, okay, queen, go off, go off, go off. It was just like a funny statement of just like putting her anarchist beliefs and then following it up with that. It was just like, okay, you can do whatever that you want to do. But she basically wrote essays. She's such a good writer. And I was looking at her essays and I was just like, oh my god, do I need to go back again because I feel like I've forgotten what she was talking about. The language back then, it's almost like it's English, but is it English? Oh, it's English, but is it? Is it really? I don't know. I don't know. Now I feel illiterate. Oh my god, I feel illiterate, which is it's like I don't know. But in one of her essays, I think it's in the traffic in women. What happens when you put women's social and economic independence on the hands of a man is that they resort to either marriage or sex work. Whether a woman sells herself in installments to different men or whether she sells herself to a lifelong contract with one man, that the difference is not in degree but rather in kind. Emma Goldman went on to also add a sex worker often retains more practical freedom to leave a disagreeable client than a respectable wife who is legally and socially trapped within a loveless marriage sanctioned by the church and state. So basically saying that, even much better for a person who is engaging in sex work, she has the liberty to leave every time, anytime she places or she gets into a disagreement with a client, unlike in a marriage setup where it's just like you are literally almost trapped. And then goes on to say that society condemns the independent sex worker while glorifying the married woman, masking what Goldman actually considered an identical commercial transaction, which the only difference is that one is under the cloak of morality. I mean, does her sentiment and her words hold in actual modern marriages right now? I don't necessarily think so. I think for low income marriages and in marriages where women are still um and the trend right now of women getting into workplaces and having the freedom to work, then the argument falls flat from that perspective. And also, but also, the remnants of it tends to rise to the surface whenever we have relationships that are transactional in an explicit manner, in that marriages that are entered into with the understanding that I am in it for access to your money. It's literally for financial gain, for material gain, for economic survival. Then I don't think there's any intellectual distinction, as Goldman put it, between that kind of marriage setup and what sex work is. However offensive we want to see it. And we can go on to argue and say that you have some legal protections which are not necessarily in the sex work industry. The critics here are definitely, I think it's pretty clear that it doesn't apply to maybe modern marriages, but it brings also about the question of like, if I am having sex with my partner, am I, in a sense, paying for things like his time, his effort, um, his emotional support? And it goes on to bring a conversation and the discourse around whether when we get into relationships they are transactional or not transactional. And my thing with that is that how you perceive it gets to really define for you what this means, because most modern relationships right now, I don't think most people, and I stand corrected, view sex as something that you do to get another thing. Am I saying that there are relationships where that is the case? Absolutely. Absolutely. The most healthy dynamics, of course, I don't view sex as something that I partake in to get another thing. It is, for most people, something that you get to share in the relationship, just like time and resources you get to mutually step into. Marriage is a commitment that involves the sharing of things like sex and resources, and that those things do not have to be directly related nor sufficient enough for us to constitute them as or correlate them as sex work. I think it gets nullified in that way, and that it is also quite disrespectful because like married life is filled with deep emotional investment, histories, and a sense of openness. So, reducing all that to just this cold financial transaction and also correlated with sex work is deeply disrespectful of how we perceive, of how we experience love. And Goldman was writing from a time where women of her time had no access to be able to economically survive without entangling themselves with men. And so, does she have a point? Do I see her point in that in conditions of severe economic abuse or coercive control, that sex can become this unspoken obligation to a transaction to ensure basic resources? I see it. Do I also see where that argument falls flat in the cases of modern marriages and how it would be quite disrespectful and insensitive and deeply unfair to say? I see that absolutely. You can clearly see where her analogy exposes an uncomfortable truth. Whenever a society or an individual deprives a person of economic options, then intimacy is highly vulnerable to becoming a transaction.